right. Well, perfect. I'm going to ask everybody who's here tonight to sign in and I'm going to put a sign in link in the chat. For those of you that don't know, Walk Bike Nashville is a nonprofit organization that's working to make Nashville more walkable, bikeable, and livable. And how we do that is through a mix of things like our events. We just had the biggest ever Tour de Nash, which is a bike tour that goes all around Nashville. We work in schools through our education, our Safe Routes to Schools program, working to teach kids in Metro Nashville public schools how to walk and bike. And then we also do adult education, teaching adults how to bike, and then also offer classes and programs like this. And then we also do more traditional advocacy. So working with council members like Angie Henderson to make policy change to help make the city more walkable and bikeable. So I think with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Nora to kick us off.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks everybody. I see a couple more folks joining here. So really excited to be here with everybody. And today we're here, like Lindsey said, for one of our most requested topics, and definitely one of the questions that we hear a lot, and one that I've really kind of learned about a lot over my time at Walk Bike Nashville. So I'm going to share my screen here. I will note we are going to have a lengthy Q&A section at the end. So if you have any questions, please add those to the chat. And Lindsey is going to be collecting those. And then she's going to kind of curate. We'll have a Q&A at the end to make sure we kind of get to as many of the questions that everybody has. So you can add them when you think of them, or you can wait till the end to enter those in the chat. And yeah, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So our question today is, where is my sidewalk? I grew up in Nashville, so maybe I got kind of used to it, but many people move here and are stunned by how few sidewalks we have. And those of us who grew up here are also continually frustrated by this problem. So Lindsey mentioned a little bit about us, but there's some cute pictures. Working to build a more walkable, bikeable, and livable city since 1998. And sidewalks have been one of our kind of central issues throughout that whole time. So just before we start, I do want to acknowledge one of the reasons that this issue is so important and really becoming increasingly important to us at Walk Bike Nashville is because pedestrian safety has become a really major crisis in our city. 2020 was the most deadly year ever for people walking in our city. We lost 39 friends, family members, community members. And you can see from this graph, the trend is not going in the right direction. So we really, as advocates, are pushing for dramatic change because we know this is not the line we want to see. And we know there's solutions to turn this around. And sidewalks are one of the many solutions. So today, I will note, yeah, it's not too surprising, unfortunately. This is, I'm sure many of you would recognize a street like this in Nashville. This is in Nashville, but it could be one of, any number of streets. The walk and bike plan, which is our city's master plan for walking and biking, which was done in 2017, kind of surveyed all the sidewalks that we have in the city and determined that about 19% of the total sidewalk network is built and 81% is missing. So if you feel like there aren't any sidewalks, it's because we really don't have that many. So I like to really start, and I think it's important to start when you're thinking about this question with our history, because if you don't know about the history of Nashville, it's kind of hard to understand how we got to where we are today. So, and I love history, so I was a history major. Nashville, like many cities, almost every city in the United States, was originally built for people to walk, to take transit, to ride horses, to ride bikes even. Our early development of the city of Nashville was around a streetcar network, which there's this really awesome map here you can see that hopefully the city's not too unrecognizable. And the streetcar network really formed the basis of a lot of the early development. So almost every street had a sidewalk. People are expected to walk in their neighborhoods to get, walk to where they were going, perhaps catch a streetcar. And so walking, transit were really at the core of our city for the early years of our development. And you can still see that if you go to any of the historic parts of town, you really can see that kind of tight grid of streets where things seem to be at the scale of someone on foot. And you can also see some of our streetcar lines sometimes popping up on our pikes. I think I saw a picture on Twitter of a streetcar line showing up on Gallatin. So this is what it started like. Then, as most of us know US history, we invented cars. We all fell in love with our cars in America. And so we really started to change how we developed our cities. So between, World War II, 1950s, afterwards, Nashville, like most other cities, started to develop around cars. There was a big push to demonize and villainize people who were walking using racial slurs. The jaywalking term is a racial slur that was developed by the car industry. Nashville itself, a lot of the streets that were originally for horses and carriages and people walking were changed to be for cars. And then, of course, we developed the interstate highway system, probably one of the greatest investments of transportation in history. And that dramatically changed how Nashville developed. Another important thing to note is while all of this was going on, we were starting to develop mostly around cars. Nashville used to be a city and then a county. Not everybody knew that. I don't think I knew that until after I got out of high school here. But the historic city of Nashville is actually today where you saw most of those sidewalks. And so it was the part of the city that was developed for people to walk and ride the light rail or the streetcar. And then the county of Nashville was really developed as a rural, suburban area, mostly after the invention of the car. So most of our suburbs, which are now part of the whole county, were built for cars. And so in 1962, there was a big push, really interesting history. The city and this county consolidated. And this map I just think is so interesting. So this shows the original boundaries of the city of Nashville. And then all of the other cities that were once separate cities and are now all part of Davidson County. And if you trace our sidewalks, most of the stuff that's in the original city today have sidewalks. Not entirely, but most of it. And a lot of that was developed before World War II. Today, the inner city is roughly where our urban zoning overlay, which is this map on the right, it's roughly correlates with the original boundaries of the city of Nashville. So one of the main things that happened when the city and the county consolidated is there was a big desire to develop the entire county. All of a sudden, you could live in Bordeaux, you could live in Donaldson, you could live in Westmead, Hillwood, and be part of the city of Nashville and have all the benefits of being in the city and get to vote and all those different things. And so we changed a lot of the zoning codes in Nashville around that time to encourage people to develop quickly throughout the entire county. And one of the big things that kind of got rolled back between 1940 and 1970 was our sidewalk requirements. So they were pretty much scrapped. And so throughout most of that development, the big boom post-World War II, boom post-consolidation of Nashville, there were no requirements for sidewalks. There were also, very importantly in Nashville, no requirements for stormwater, curb and gutter. And so we know it rains a lot in Nashville. So half of the cost of a sidewalk is actually the stormwater infrastructure to replace the ditch that's probably there right now. So these, the policy changes that happened to encourage growth and development and to make it as cheap as possible. That's, of course, building a sidewalk and a ditch and a gutter is expensive. Really continued throughout the rest of the 20th century up until almost present day, which is the amazing thing. So probably the best answer for why you don't have a sidewalk wherever you live in Nashville, and I grew up in Nashville on a street without a sidewalk, is because most of our city was developed post-World War II, and during that time we just decided not to require them. So when the early city was developed, we had the sidewalks, and then as we expanded out, we lost them. So really interesting exercise. If you look at this is the urban zoning overlay, again, roughly where the historic city was. Really, within a half a mile, you can look on either side of this historic boundary of the city, and you can see, 12 South, that great sidewalk network, over to Stokes Lane, just the other side of the interstate, the other side of the historic boundary, no sidewalks. So you can really see that the significance of that historic boundary. Same in East Nashville. The difference between East Nashville, kind of Laughlin Springs area, and Englewood is huge in terms of sidewalks. And that really kind of speaks to the history of our zoning code and our development patterns. So how do we fix it? Okay, we are, our forebears of planning and development kind of fell down on the job and didn't realize how important it would be for us to walk and how much our city was going to develop. So there's kind of three buckets that we're going to just chat about today. The first is private development. That has historically been how most sidewalks were built and is still a really major part of how we're going to kind of address this huge gap. The second is our city's capital sidewalk program, which I'm going to get into a little bit, kind of cover how those decisions are made and some of the pros and cons of that, that type of project. So that's where the city, out of our taxpayer dollars, is paying for sidewalks that don't exist today. And then the last bucket I'm going to touch on is also how can we make our streets pedestrian friendly without a sidewalk? Because ultimately, the reason we want sidewalks is so that we can all walk, whether it's for recreation, to get to the bus, to get to the grocery store. And so we really need to be starting to think about what can we do besides potentially building a sidewalk so that we can still achieve the same goal. So I'm going to turn this first section over to Council Member Henderson, who is really the foremost expert in the city on our sidewalk zoning code, to kind of let us know where we're at.
Thank you, Nora. I think I love the way Nora's presented the history, because I serve a suburban district in Southwest Nashville, so I'm outside of the urban zoning overlay. So really with no sidewalks at all, excepting in a few places in kind of multifamily commercial areas and areas like Green Hills through what we called specific plan zoning. And so for a long while, that was really the only way to kind of get sidewalks in Nashville, is if you had a specific plan zoning, you could stipulate sidewalks. And so I used to volunteer for Walk By Nashville, and then also for a group called the Green Hills Action Partners. And we were working to deliver an urban village plan in Green Hills. And so a lot of what we did was kind of meeting with developers and saying, hey, I know you're not required to build a sidewalk here, but you know, it would be great if you would, right? Kind of standing in the breach to encourage people, and like, oh, nobody walks here, we don't need them. And so we've evolved quite a lot in that time. So, you know, I was hosting like Walk Nashville Week events, you know, walk to lunch day and things like that, back kind of around 2000. You know, when my daughter was an infant, I remember putting up the posters when she was in her little carrier. And so now I'm serving on the city council and working in this policy space. And so I ran for office on a Safe Streets platform to update our sidewalk legislation. I had been doing a lot of advocacy work, again, little pieces here and there, whether through capital investment or redevelopment, and just recognize that this is never going to change at scale unless we change the policy. And so in 2017, we had a variety of stakeholder meetings and delivered the sidewalk bill. And to Nora's point, that was really the first major update. We had started to require sidewalks internal to subdivisions. And that was sort of slow in coming. They were sort of skinny sidewalks on one side of the road in a subdivision, and then it was on two sides of the road in a subdivision. But especially out here in suburbia, you know, you can walk around internal to a subdivision, but what happens when you get out to the collector street and you actually need to go somewhere? There's not a sidewalk there. So we started to see more sidewalk through development. As Nora said, they're sort of, you know, through private development, through capital infrastructure, and then through other modes, internal to subdivisions, and then in multifamily and commercial development. And the new sidewalk legislation, pretty much the simplest way to say it is all multifamily and commercial new construction requires sidewalks now. All commercial renovation of a certain magnitude requires sidewalks now. So that is a key piece of that. And then Nora, at this point, do you want me to talk about single and two family, or are you going to segue back into that? Or, okay, here, yeah, yep. And so what was new about this sidewalk policy was that for single and two family development, as Nora said, we had not required that in Nashville for many, many decades. I often share with folks, we are 70 years behind on walkable infrastructure because we were super enamored of our cars and everybody just thought, well, who would even need to walk anywhere? So we brought that requirement back in though, when you're working, 70 years in reverse, you can't just blanket say for 532 square miles, sidewalks are now required everywhere. That simply will not work. So we came up with a strategic framework, and that's kind of illustrated here. So the urban zoning overlay, the old city of Nashville, for the most part, that Nora was showing you earlier, that is part of the strategic framework. So, if you are within that it has your requirements. If you're outside of that, whether there's an existing sidewalk, if you're on a collector street and so forth. So you can kind of see the pattern here. Nora, is that back to you? You tell me. I'm not sure what your next slide is, but.
Yeah, I think maybe just since this is so complicated, we can go to how people can figure out where sidewalks are required and kind of the resources out there.
Yes, I did. Do you have that screen that shows them? Yes. Okay. So on nashville.gov, anybody can go to the planning department / long range planning / transportation / sidewalks, or just go on Google and say, like Metro Nashville sidewalks. Usually this is one of the top things that you'll find. And this, part of delivering legislation at this scale for 532 square miles in diverse kind of, zonings and different things is that implementation is really key to the success of legislation. So you can't just sort of pass a bill and be like, all right, we're done here. You really have to make sure that on the back end, you have the tools, you engage the stakeholder communities. And so, we've got an FAQ on this website. We also have a sidewalk requirement map. So you can click on that and see if there were to be new development at this location, would it trigger a sidewalk? And that you can also see kind of aligned with existing infrastructure and some of the priority network on that. So that, if you were looking for residential 1 or 2 family, you clicked on that parcel, then you could see if that were required. And, so part of that strategic framework is looking at arterials, collector streets. Those are our faster streets. They're our more dangerous streets. That's where we need to prioritize our requirements. And then also, because of the miracles of GIS mapping, which is really helpful when you're doing policy for 532 square miles, what we call centers or Nashville Next centers. So internal to centers and in a 1/4 mile buffer or proximity of centers, we also have our sidewalk requirements because we want folks to be able to walk into those areas where we have more density and trip generators and retail and transit and so forth. So this is, I think, a good place for anybody to kind of go and learn a little bit more and kind of just play around with it and look at different places. Because, if you kind of think like, well, why wasn't a sidewalk built there? Or why was it required here or there? Because in some places, even when sidewalks are required, if it's kind of out in suburbia and there's nothing else on that block face and it's not going to otherwise connect, we do allow for contribution in lieu of building a sidewalk. Sometimes also there is a legitimate hardship there because of topography or stormwater. And so we put that into a pedestrian benefit zone for capital projects. And then what we also, if needed to construct a sidewalk to our major and collector street plan standard, we also require a dedication of right-of-way or pedestrian easement. And, so even if someone is, not building that sidewalk, there is a contribution to our capital sidewalk program, and garnering that right of way if needed. And part of the real kind of cost and time it takes to build sidewalks in Nashville, again, because we're retrofitting suburban, working backwards, is acquiring right away. If you can imagine going down the street, parcel after parcel after parcel, we have to pay folks for that land and easement. And that takes time to effectuate. So the legislation contemplates that and addresses that as well. So Nora, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. And if folks have questions about the sidewalk bill or kind of how it applies, definitely toss those in the chat and we can circle back to them, because it is complicated. The flow chart was just half of the flow chart, and you spend a while looking at it.
The flow chart.
Yeah. So the other side, I'll move on here, is the city sidewalk program. And I don't work for the city, but I've learned a lot about it over the years. And so there's a lot of technical components too, but kind of the big picture is laid out in Walk and Bike, the plan I referenced earlier, which is actually being updated this year. So if you're interested in this next slide section, definitely stay tuned to get involved with that process. So this Walk and Bike plan, which is the city's master plan, lays out a priority sidewalk network. So the priority sidewalk network is just 71 miles, which is a lot of miles of sidewalk, but thinking back to how much is missing is a relatively small drop in the bucket. And it estimates that that's going to cost $525 million, which it kind of envisions could be built over the next 20 years. So this next part is where it gets a little frustrating, I will warn you. So the $525 million was going to take us 20 years if we spent $30 million a year, according to the plan. And this is a quick snapshot of how much the city has been spending on sidewalks. And so this is from the capital spending plan, which the mayor releases most years, kind of laying out what the city is going to actually invest in. This is all the stuff the city is buying: the new schools, the new roads, the new sidewalks. And sidewalks have been a pretty big priority over the last, 5 to 10 years. You can see $30 million a bunch of years in a row. Obviously, the pandemic hit this program like most programs, but we were very excited to see the program funded at a relatively high level this most recent year. But the challenge we have is, again, those sidewalk projects, which everyone's super eager to see and you sometimes see around town, really just speak to that 71-mile priority sidewalk network. The entire missing sidewalk network is 1,900 miles of sidewalks. So most of us, I think you could probably just guess, probably live on a street without sidewalks or know someone who does. And unfortunately, the gap of sidewalks is somewhere in the many, many billions of dollars. I did a very rough back the napkin estimation, but we really are it's beyond what we will ever be able to pay. So that's the bad news. The reality is, if you live on a quiet neighborhood street, there's a good chance the city will never be building a sidewalk for you. So the big question then is, where are they going? We are spending $30 million a year or so. It's a significant chunk of change. That's taxpayer dollars. And so the big debate really, and the tough decisions come down to prioritization, because we know most people are going to be disappointed. So we need to make kind of those tough decisions. So Walk and Bike lays out kind of focus areas, and they're in these 4 buckets. One is health and equity. So in the top 2 tiers of health and equity analysis, demand. So kind of, again, speaking to those, where there's density, where there's neighborhood attractors, transit, Nashville Next in centers and neighborhoods. So Nashville Next is the city's general plan, and that plan really envisions Nashville developing around centers. So if you think 5 Points, downtown, Hillsborough Village, Donaldson Village, those are the centers, and then the corridors, which would be Gallatin, Murfreesboro, Nolensville, et cetera. And so it kind of takes those focus areas and then puts these inputs. And so again, a lot of data went into the original selection of the priority zone. And you can see those here. Lots of great things, transit access, safety is very high priority for us, if not the highest priority, equity. And so this level of input I will note is, I think, going to be updated this year. So if you feel like you really think something is on here that shouldn't be, or there's something on here should definitely stay, like we will be advocating certainly for safety to be a #1 factor. That's going to be updated this year, so stay tuned. So all that comes out, and then we get the 71 miles of sidewalk priorities. And then the challenge is that's like a 20 to 30 year work plan. So the city is slowly chipping away at that work plan. And so, you know, it can be pretty painfully slow. I think it is for almost everybody involved. And there is a sidewalk project tracker. So if you're curious what projects are underway, which ones are recently completed, which ones are planned, you can go to this website, which is, I usually just Google Nashville Sidewalk Project Tracker, and this pops up. But, you know, you'll see here, it's a little disappointing, you know, for $30 million a year, this is what we're getting. And there's lots to be said about how can we speed it up and how can we make it more affordable. And I think those are all still important, but I think at the end of the day, the city is never going to be able to build us out of the challenge. So it's about how can the city really build those sidewalks that are going to save lives, are going to be connecting a lot of people and connecting the things our community really cares about. So that's why we did want to kind of finish with some of the other things that can be done, because it can be a little frustrating, particularly if your neighborhood's not developing a lot, or you don't want it to be developing, to kind of be told your best hope is that it redevelops is not always a good solution for a lot of neighborhoods. So what we continue to advocate for sidewalk funding, and hope you join us in that, and we continue to try to get the policy to get us as much as we can from private development. And Nashville's booming, certainly, but we're also really starting to think about how can we advocate for safer streets, even when that can't include a sidewalk. So one great success recently is the big improvements we've seen in the traffic calming program. And this program actually got the most funding ever for it. It's like $2.5 million in this most recent capital spending plan, and an additional member of staff. And so there is this works through an application process at the moment. So it's going to be coming up, and we'll probably have a whole separate training at some point in July with Public Works on how this program works. But this program, I think, is one of the most important things we can do, because, you know, how do we make a neighborhood, your street safe when we know they're probably not going to be getting a sidewalk while we're still here walking on it. And a big part of that is just how do we slow cars down and reduce the number of cars on that street where appropriate. So
and Nora, I would add, I think, you know, this is something that several council members, myself included, have really been kind of beating the drum about traffic calming, bringing that back kind of internal to Metro, staffing it appropriately, funding it appropriately, because, you know, to your point, given how far behind we are, we do have to, in neighborhood contexts where we can lower the speed and share the road, whether walking or biking, that's going to be really important to kind of catching up and building the network. So I think, you know, that has been citizen advocacy and interest in that program, and council members and organizations like Walk Bike, you know, pushing for that. So, you know, while the sidewalk number seems really daunting, this is something that we can deliver at scale, and we can deliver much more quickly. And the menu is more robust now too, even in suburban context, to be able to have kind of the speed cushions that you see here. For so long, those were just not even on the menu. Like the city would not entertain that, and people kept kind of saying that that's really important. And then I'll point out also from a policy standpoint and policy change, the internal, again, to that urban zoning overlay, or I guess actually our urban services district, we've delivered on 25 miles per hour for all our neighborhood streets. And so that is, I think, just finished with the implementation. And I think that's an important factor, because, you know, if you don't have a sidewalk and you do have to share the road, having that speed lower is important. And so now, you know, it used to be that folks participating in this traffic calming program were looking to bring their speed down to 25. Now there's a lot of streets for which 20 is indeed plenty, you know, and depending on the width of the road and so forth. So I think we'll see, you know, streets that maybe were 25, you know, coming down to 20. I know in my own district, I'm starting to change some with broad community support, some collector streets from 35 to 30. And so that culture change is an important shift. You know, the number on the sign doesn't fix it, but it is something that with traffic calming and tactical things on the road, we can do to kind of come alongside with the sidewalk program to deliver safer walking.
Yeah, and I think our last note is maybe I'll toss it back to you, Council Member. There's also a lot of other kind of related issues, which we'll just kind of gloss over here, but can talk about more in depth. So maybe the latest on street trees, which are often a form of traffic calming, and sidewalk closures and repairs.
Agreed. I often say that, you know, trees are traffic calming. Unfortunately, in Nashville, in most of our suburban sprawled areas, our power lines are also in front yards too. I live in a kind of 1940s suburban neighborhood, and all our power lines are behind our houses. We don't have sidewalks, but we do have beautiful tree streets, and we have narrower streets. In fact, just the right of way is more narrow, and so 25 miles per hour feels right in this neighborhood. So, you know, a lot of, whether through traffic calming or through implementation of tree planting programs, we're looking to bring some of those other things to bear. My most recent legislation was our expanding our street tree policy. So up until last year, the only place that street trees were required in Nashville was within our downtown core, in our downtown code. And so my legislation, because we, again, 532 square miles, you can't just all of a sudden say everywhere sidewalks are required, street trees are required too. So we said for multifamily and commercial development internal to centers, and those are really diffuse all across the county. I think that's one slide we should add for another time. That's a centers map, showing where those all are all across the county. But where sidewalks are required, street trees are now also required too. And so working through the technical things for implementation of that, it's challenging, but we're glad to have that policy in place now. And we continue to struggle with closures and appropriate reroutings for pedestrians. Something that you will see in the budget is new positions for right-of-way inspection in that space. And I think as we move to a DOT, additionally, another fee study, you know, council and the community has been pretty vigorous in saying, you know, that the cost to block this stuff off it's just too low, and there's no incentive, you know, so it's basically like, all right, we'll just take this lane or take this sidewalk. And so, you know, council had earlier in last term contemplated and looking at, you know, scaffolding, you know, in our downtown area. And so there's more work to be done in that space. But I think with DOT and extra staffing and more intention, we're going to get more kind of coverage to address those issues. And then I guess repairs, that is always ongoing. And, you know, I encourage everybody to use hub.nashville.gov. If you see sidewalks that need repair, absolutely submit them. There's always a bucket of funding for that. So.
Yeah, those sometimes happen fastest of all of the programs if there's already a sidewalk that needs repair. So. Yes. Thanks to whoever on Twitter I stole this picture from. This was locally and certainly something that drives me nuts. And I'm sure it does everyone else. Once we've spent all this effort and money to get a sidewalk and then it's closed by a construction project for a year. But great, well, I think that is the end of our slides. So, last, I guess, yeah, I'll just highlight this, what you can do. Oops. Oh, there we go. definitely, I think it's, one of the reasons Walk Bike Nashville exists, and one of our primary causes is trying to get more people involved in this, because the more people are talking about it, the more people are talking about it with their council member and their neighborhood association, the higher it rises in, the prioritization discussion at budgeting time and at staffing time. And this year, I think, was a great success of many years' efforts to get more staff at Metro Public Works, our soon to be new Department of Transportation. We are getting a new sidewalk person, a new bike person, a new traffic calming person. And I think that's thanks to a lot of kind of many year interest and effort from a lot of different people and folks like Council Member Henderson. So definitely make sure your voice is being heard, even if it seems like it's not helping. Make sure you're advocating for at the budget time, which Lindsey just wrapped up. We're getting close to wrapping up kind of the operating budget season, but that's a really important, now is an important time to share your support for those new staff positions. Engage in upcoming discussions around sidewalk prioritization. So if you're on our email list, you'll definitely be hearing about those opportunities. It is an impossible decision to decide who gets one and who doesn't, because there's so much need, but we definitely want to make sure it's done as best as it can be. Traffic calming program, which will be opening up in July. Staying on top of the developers. I think, Councilmember Henderson started as an advocate in this respect, and I think it's so important that if you're seeing something happening in your neighborhood, that you're talking to your neighborhood association, making sure you at least understand what's going on and why, because neighborhoods do have a voice often in those conversations. And then last, we'd love to have you become a member. We are, like Lindsey said, a nonprofit, so we'd love to have you join us and share your time and efforts and funds, and we can hopefully keep moving the needle forward. So with that, I think questions.
We had so many good questions.
I know, I saw
so many good questions. So thank you all for putting those all in the chat. And if we don't have time to get to your question, because we want to keep it to an hour here, council member has graciously offered to follow up on things that might need follow up on her end. And we are also dedicated to making sure to get back to you and get answers to all of your questions if we don't have time. So also, if you think of one as we're talking and we don't get to it, just keep putting stuff in the chat, because I'll pull everything out and really try to get to everyone. If not here, then afterwards. So let's get into it. So there's a lot of questions about developer built sidewalks. And one question, we have horrible developer built sidewalks, someone says. Is there any way we could just force developers to pay into a capital fund instead?
The short answer to that is no. The state of Tennessee does not allow impact fees. And so part of the sidewalk policy is looking at aligning what our requirements with our strategic plan and our needs. It's very important to show kind of a logical nexus for why sidewalks are required where they are. We do allow the contribution in lieu, but it's not just sort of an upfront, okay, in this area, pay into this sidewalk fund. That is not allowed by state law. And I will say, even as structured, I'm very proud of our sidewalk legislation. I have folks in other cities who reach out to me about the policy that we implemented. And to Nora's point, it was something that for many years, because of its complexity, and we were getting further and further behind, it seemed very daunting to undertake and deliver. And I'm proud of the council. I had 37 co-sponsors when that passed in 2017. But even now, the Beacon Center and others are trying to overturn the legislation. And there was a preemptive caption bill at the state legislature this year. It has not been without contention, but for the most part, I think the community supports it. Commercial and multifamily developers have supported it from the beginning. Home builders have been somewhat less supportive, and that's not in their entirety, but that's a longer answer to the simple no, we can't just have.
Yeah. So there were a few different versions of that question. Like, we know we have in lieu of, right? So we're requiring them, developers, to pay into a fund if they're not going to build the sidewalk. But is there a way, to require builders to add sidewalks in neighborhoods that are being redeveloped at higher densities at a faster pace? Are there ways, like we have someone put in the Harding House development is building 28 new homes, yet we have numerous kids walking to school without any sidewalks. Are these developers being held to a standard of putting in sidewalks outside of the planned development because they're adding so many more people to the neighborhood? So I think the answer is going to be no from what you just said, but because a few people asked that a few different ways, we really want to understand a little bit better.
Yeah. Off-site improvements, and though I, absolutely kind of see the logic, if your development was kind of far down at the end of a road or a dead end, why couldn't you put that money to a sidewalk that was, closer to the school or closer to the park? But again, in making sure that our legislation stands up kind of to state law potential preemption, off-site contribution has been something that our legal experts say is probably not something that we want to do.
I will add one twist, though, is one silver line or glimmer of hope is the traffic impact studies. So when some large developments, especially special plans developments, they're required to do a traffic impact study, and historically the result of that has been add another turn lane, add a right turn signal, pay for a stop sign, and we are really hopeful that those can be improved to really start to think about how do we look at the transportation impacts from all modes. And so maybe it wouldn't be a sidewalk probably, but we might be able to require, and I think the first cases happened, we've required like a hybrid pedestrian beacon at a development for the first time has happened in the city. And so there are some potential workarounds that I think a lot of great folks at the city are exploring. So.
Okay, and I feel like related, we had kind of come up, there was just a new tax announced for downtown intended to partially pay for beautification and cleanliness of that area. I guess there's, yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to that. I think that was in the context of the downtown business improvement district. And so that we have a business improvement district in downtown. We've got one in the Gulch, and they've actually implemented one out in the southeast area. Mm-hmm. But I feel very strongly, as far behind as we are on infrastructure, for delivering those streetscape improvements in a county of our size, we have got to start to implement and scale up business improvement districts. And so those are special kind of taxing districts. So, in my area, kind of the largest kind of commercial center, as Nora said, kind of defined by Nashville Next, is Green Hills. And so, hypothetically, and there's been a fair amount of talk about this ever since the 1999 Green Hills Urban Village Plan, that property owners in that area would pay a little bit extra, and they would have, a strategic plan that said, we want to do this wayfinding, we want elevated brick crosswalks, we want, these kind of street lights, and those would be, that would be managed specifically by a board. And usually what you find in other cities that have implemented these is folks don't mind paying a little bit more when they know it's going to go to these very specific things in this immediate area, rather than throwing it in the big bucket, and hoping that it gets back to that area through capital prioritization. And so, that's something that I have discussed with our mayor and our planning office and our new economic community development, all of our legacy chambers, Donaldson Hermitage, Bellevue Harpeth, all those areas really can start laying the groundwork, I think, to have these special taxing increments to deliver on infrastructure. And that is enabled by state legislation. So it is something that we can do. And as far behind as we are, I think it's something Nashville really needs to do.
Yeah, and so then that answers a question someone else asked. Are there neighborhoods in the county which do not have enough tax base to self-sufficiently? Ooh, I read this wrong. I said, I read it as, are there neighborhoods that have enough tax base to self-sufficiently fund the building and maintenance of sidewalks with their current zoning pattern? But what they actually asked was, do not have enough tax base to self-sufficiently fund the building.
So that is really not, you see that dialogue sometimes in other cities that are not city county consolidated. And so, there's some good things about city county consolidation and there's some challenges with it, but, Nashville is pretty prescient in that regard. We did not kind of lose that revenue through kind of suburban flight. And so, when your property taxes are garnered, they are going kind of back into the general fund. And to then be, through our operational budget, or through our capital spending plan and the debt service to that, prioritized as capital investments. So you're not seeing, I would say the city of Belmead, when we did city county consolidation, the existing small cities, if they had certain authorities, policing authority, taxing authority, so Belmead, much in the same way we're talking about a business improvement district, they have an extra taxing increment. They have property taxes above and beyond Metro's property taxes. So they are using that to deliver some new sidewalk infrastructure. But our other just sort of neighborhood or various areas, they don't necessarily have independent or special taxing authority.
Yeah, which I feel like also answers someone asked, will the new increase in property taxes being implemented, will that help? Is sidewalks part of what those funds will pay for? And I think the answer is yes.
Generally, yes. I mean, the tax increase, it's kind of catching us up all across the board. So you're seeing that, and Nora spoke to that as far as the DOT goes, being able to implement that and increase staffing. Public Works has been woefully understaffed for a really long time. And so, the tax dollars go into the operational budget to support staff, to support programs, to deliver this infrastructure. So yes.
Okay, back to in lieu of fees quickly. Somebody asked, are the dollars required to be submitted in lieu of fees? Are they equivalent to the cost of a sidewalk being built? And sort of related, somebody asked, when a sidewalk is built using the in lieu of funds, how is that communicated? It feels like maybe we don't know where, people never hear where the money goes and where the sidewalks end up being built.
Right. Agreed. I will answer the latter first because I do concur with that. We have 16 pedestrian benefit zones. And part of why we have those zones is really from an equity perspective, because, where you're seeing kind of development over here and, making sure that we're kind of spreading those dollars equitably around the county. But I certainly understand from the community standpoint, oh, well, somebody contributed in lieu, darn it, we didn't get the sidewalk. You'd much rather see that, coming back through a capital investment in a crosswalk a little further down the road, or a sidewalk that's closer to the school where that was not, sidewalk wasn't built. But I think Public Works probably needs to do kind of a better job. And we've had some talk about, should we have pedestrian benefit zones? Should it be council districts because those are smaller? And I think from an implementation standpoint, we didn't really have the staffing to kind of communicate and implement around that. So, these dollars are absolutely going into the correct pedestrian benefit zone, and they are being applied to capital projects. But typically it's just, what is the capital project internal to that pedestrian benefit zone? And you're just tacking it on to the back, and so if we garner 3 million in contribution in lieu, which is the last time I remember the most recent calculation, that in our best year is 10% of our capital investment. So that's no small amount, but it's basically just getting kind of put into larger projects, which makes it less visible, and it just doesn't feel as great to the community, right? Because it wasn't built here. You want to see sort of a tangible, smaller thing built elsewhere, but it is going appropriately into some of the bigger projects. And then I guess the other part of that, Lindsey, is the amount in lieu commensurate with the cost to Metro? No. But also, the cost to Metro, we can't double dip, because even if you contribute, if as a home builder, or you choose to contribute in lieu, or you're in lieu eligible, not everywhere is even in lieu eligible. So let's say that again, with that kind of flow chart and process map, internal to the UZO, or the old city of Nashville, where in the most part about 75% of that area was historically kind of sidewalked, with some exceptions. You are not just by default in lieu eligible. When you get out in the more suburban areas, where you might go street after street and have no sidewalks at all, and have stormwater infrastructure, and just putting one segment can be very problematic from a stormwater standpoint, that's when you're typically in lieu eligible. But what you're also required to do is contribute right away if needed, to build to our major and collector street plan standard. And so that is you're garnering that cost, right? So you can't, we know what that typically is on average, but we don't put that in our contribution in lieu calculation, because that would be double dipping. Because if we're saying to you, you've got to contribute this right away, and then here's the cost per linear foot. So we're averaging out basically the cost of our big capital projects and our repair projects over the course of the year, with our big outliers kind of taken out. And then that's where we get that number. And that calculation is actually codified in the legislation.
Whew, that's complicated. That's complicated, but the short answer is no, it's not exactly.
Not quite.
But there's a lot of reasons why it's no. I hear you, for sure. So somebody asked, I mean, in terms of the cost, doesn't the city own 5 feet into homeowners' land as an easement?
So it varies. Right away varies street by street. And typically it's the back of your kind of water main box, or your water meter box, but not always. And so depending though on kind of where you are in the city, and the width of the right of way, and the ditch infrastructure, it's not always that right of way is sufficient to build a safe and comfortable sidewalk. And so a lot of what you saw in our last kind of, I hesitate to even call it a boom, but maybe kind of the Purcell administration around that time, and in the Dean administration, some of the sidewalks that were built, those are those really not great 5-foot sidewalks that are right on the edge of collector streets, which typically had broader right of ways. So yes, you did have that 5 feet, but how comfortable does it feel to walk with your child on a 5-foot sidewalk as cars blow past you at 35 or 40 miles an hour? That's not great. And so our new standard has a furnishing zone, or kind of a green buffer that allows, depending on the width of the street, for street trees. It's a place to put the power poles. It's a place to put the mailboxes, and it just provides a physical buffer that's especially important on collector streets. So yes, sometimes, but the sidewalk infrastructure that we can deliver, and that might be fine on a neighborhood street near a center. That might be okay to have a 5-foot sidewalk right on the road. And so the legislation does also contemplate alternative design. So if there is sufficient right of way, you got some stormwater implications, you can deliver a different design within that right of way sometimes, but it varies.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And then sort of related, love this idea. Why can't we just narrow the road and use the existing space from the
Yes.
roadway instead of competing with private landowners.
Yeah.
Nora looks like she wants
Yes,
that.
Nora, please. I
mean,
see Nora here, so yeah.
I don't know the answer, but I think I've only seen that happen once in the city's history. So I think that's a great question. I do know there are challenges with narrowing the roadway in terms of stormwater, because all of our roads are designed to deal with water. And so if you cut off part of it, it messes up the curvature of the total road. Not being an engineer, that's what I hear, but I don't know if you know other reasons, but I agree.
Yeah, well, I absolutely think, part of our kind of sprawling and building roads and designing for speed and throughput is often the lanes really are too wide, which contributes to speeding. So I mentioned my neighborhood earlier, we've been 25 miles per hour over here. We were one of the first traffic calming neighborhoods like 15 plus years ago. And it works because we have narrower right away, and it does kind of slow you down. So yes, I would like to see that, especially when, we have very little kind of newer, development actually building kind of streets aside from subdivisions, but that can work. But again, when you're working backwards for a city that's already laid out, I mean, at what point, we were looking at that, in fact, internal to our centers with our street tree requirements, trying to kind of think like, what's a good cross section to deliver more space for the street trees to be successful, wanting to kind of get another foot out of that. And, my take on that was like, well, why don't we just take it out of the lane? Because then that traffic calms the street, and that's what we want in walkable centers. But the technical aspect of sort of delivering that, in segments and what that cross section is. Yes, I mean, I concur with whomever asked the question. Narrower lane widths are great, but it's not as simple as just kind of taking it out of the road.
Yeah, so I think we have time for one more, and then if I didn't get to yours, I'll be following up and be sure to get it answered. But this is a common question we get to, and I know the answer is complicated, but and I know you probably don't have the specifics about this specific development, but we have an 80-unit development planned at the bottom of our neighborhood. Seems like sidewalks should be included in such a large development. It's the Elvira in East Nashville, but we hear this all the time. So how do these developments get passed without sidewalks?
So there is no way that an 80-unit multifamily development is going to be built without triggering the sidewalk requirement. So I mean, if that person is kind of prospectively anticipating that it might not be, I've not seen us waive or otherwise for something that is that significant a size of development. Usually where you are seeing through our waiver process are kind of one-off, single 2-family development that's sort of mid-block in a suburban context with stormwater implications, that might be a granted waiver based on a hardship to contribute in lieu. But for an 80-unit multifamily development, sidewalks will absolutely be required.
Okay, great. We can chase that one down. Putting sidewalks on the inside of the development, but not along Elvira.
Oh, okay. Well, so sometimes when things are developed through our subdivision regs, which kind of happen in a different lane, that are kind of enabled by state law. So there's 80-unit kind of multifamily, like a building, and then there's an 80-house subdivision. So I apologize if maybe that development is what we're talking about there. And that's something that from a policy perspective, I have asked 80-house subdivision. I see the little chat popping up there. Okay, so subdivision regs are going to require sidewalks on both sides of the street internal to the development. But yes, to your point, that's something I have on my list because I have been seeing that. And I think we need to just make that explicit in our subdivision regs. Sometimes it varies depending on the context. do you necessarily want a curb and gutter sidewalk? If it's out in a more rural area, it maybe should be a multi-use path or a kind of bikeway walking path, depending on where it is, kind of context based wise. But making sure to get the sidewalk on the frontage, I think, is really important because historically that has been a problem, right? You don't just want people to kind of walk around internal to their subdivision and never be able to get on the outside. But I can look a little more closely at that Elvira one and figure out about that.
Well, thank you. We're just at time right now. Thank you so much for that rapid fire Q&A, council member. That was impressive. So thank you for going through all of that with everyone here. And yeah, like I said, if we didn't get to your question, I'll follow up via email. But I really appreciate everybody being here. And like Nora said, wanting to make an improvement, to learn more about sidewalks, to make a change in your neighborhood. And we are here, Walk Bike Nashville, as a resource to help you do that and to help you understand why things are the way they are, but also how we might be able to change them. So please never hesitate to be in touch. We're on all the social medias, we're on email. All our emails are posted on our website. You can always call us too. We really like to make ourselves available to people who have questions about why things are the way they are in their neighborhood and how they might be able to change it. So with that, I think I'll end the meeting unless Nora, council member, you have anything else to add?
I just want to concur that I'm always happy to answer questions about sidewalk and sidewalk policy. And your council member is usually first name dot last name at nashville.gov. And so for me, that means Angie.Henderson at nashville.gov. And I'll have Lindsey relay me any of the questions that did not get answered and get you a response, or you're always welcome to contact me individually. So thank you.
Yeah, and
yeah, go ahead.
I'll just finish up by saying I love that, like, we need more ideas. So that this is such an enormous problem that I love all these ideas and definitely keep thinking, because it's not going to be solved in any one way. So the more different ways we can come up with to narrow streets, change regulations, whatever we need, let's do them all, because that's kind of what we're going to need to do.
Yeah. And we do have a regularly monthly advocacy meeting. We call it the Advocacy Corner. And our next one is next Wednesday at 6 p.m. same time via Zoom. I'll send it in the follow-up email I send about this meeting. I'll send information about that meeting. And that's just another way to get plugged into work we're doing to make change in Nashville. So thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. Let's get some more sidewalks, everyone. See you soon.